for TEXSOM, you aren't talking about Australia at all. You and Nick Davis, y'all are going to do a seminar on service. Tell me what you guys want people to walk away from this seminar with.
This is first kind of like a part two from what I did last year with Joe Zamorski. Nick and I are certainly still planning things. However, I'm hoping we're not kind of pitting this to any kind of certification, that this is much more useful in everyday real world scenarios and real businesses.
Love it.
The idea is some service scenarios. The way in which we handle, work our way through, or apply service tactics to those scenarios, those are all very much functions that you can learn, practice. I know we don't have a lot of ability to do a ton of demonstrations, but we're going to try and do a few, and hopefully we can get the audience involved in some manner as well.
Ciao, y'all. I'm Jessica Dupuy, guest host for a special TEXSOM series on the Italian Wine Podcast, covering the 2025 TEXSOM Conference in Dallas, Texas. Join me in the heart of the Lone Star State as we dive into conversations with key speakers and attendees, exploring career paths, challenges, and the latest trends shaping the wine industry today. This series is proudly sponsored by the Texas Department of Agriculture's Uncork Texas Wines program, which celebrates Texas wine culture by promoting local wineries and grape growers, both in-state and around the world, building a vibrant community around the Texas-made wine. Be sure to subscribe and rate the show wherever you get your podcasts. And don't miss our Texas wine tidbit in every episode, a fun little fact, insight, or story that highlights the people and places behind this exciting wine scene. All right. Well, Jonathan Ross, thank you so much for joining us on the Italian Wine Podcast for this special TEXSOM series. I'm thrilled to have you. Let's start, kind of broadly and tell us a little bit about your background. I'll let you cover it, but you're a sommelier, you're an importer, you're a winemaker, you've kind of done all the things. So let us know how and why.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Jessica. Yeah, I started working in restaurants while going to school in New Jersey, and I was studying first sports medicine and then architecture, and I just enjoyed going to work at a restaurant more than I did going to school. So I left school and focused on restaurants, and then kind of did a local hospitality degree in New Jersey, and I guess I was just totally bought in. I loved everything about it. I was working at a restaurant in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where I would take the van, the company van, to the Green Market in Union Square weekly and call the chef and buy the produce. I'd stop at the strawberry farm down the street from my parents' house and pick strawberries on the way to work. It was just such a fortunate way to be introduced to hospitality with an extremely authentic connection to food. And I think that really set me up on a really wonderful path. That restaurant was called Stage Left. They're on their 34th year. They're pretty incredible. And then there was a point where I was like, if I'm going to do this full time and for my life, I need to move to New York. So I moved to New York. I got my first job in New York when I was 24. And at that point, Mark and Francis at Stage Left had already kind of, we're teaching wine and so on. And I had passed the intro and certified portions from the CMS. Yeah, went into New York and found myself, I didn't realize that, a young, energetic, could work 90 hours a week and didn't really care, was kind of, in demand then. Young people to use and abuse. That's what the restaurant industry wanted. So I was very quickly became the AGM of a Michelin-starred Greek restaurant. At 24, I was paid $38,000 a year, and I worked 80 hours a week.
In New York?
In New York. And I loved it. And then pay got a little bit better over the years. And then, it just kind of continued. And I think being immersed in that restaurant industry culture, it was this really kind of blossoming time for the wine industry, and was totally swept up in it. I was very much, fortunate to be kind of in the right place at the right time in a lot of ways. And then kind of worked in a number of different restaurants. And in 2017, Jane, we were already working together and living together. I'd been this head sommelier at Madison Park for about 5 years. And she got a job offer to go run a restaurant in Melbourne, Australia, the wine program restaurant in Australia called Attica. And we said, why not? And we left, and we went for 3 years. We'd never been before. And up until that point, my only connection to the wine industry was the very final moment of a bottle of wine. I had probably managed restaurants more than had specific sommelier roles. Wine has always kind of been part of the whole for me. It's not the thing.
Mm.
I started bartending before I ever learned about wine. We got to Australia and we were living within an hour of 5 different wine regions. Sure, I'd go up to the Finger Lakes every now and then or to Napa or whatever, but it was never there all the time and so easily accessible. So, like, kind of the door flung wide open, and there were just opportunities to become completely ingrained in the wine industry from raw material from the farm all the way to the table. And that, when you're working in a big city that's not near a wine industry, it's really hard to have that relationship with wine. So the time in Australia was really profound in a lot of ways. And it's totally guided the rest of our career since then. We came back to the US in 2020 and started importing Australian wine.
That was a really concise way of putting that all together. Because when I hear about you, first of all, Jane Lopes, we should mention, like, she kind of stands on her own in the wine industry here in terms of just recognizability and her hard work in the industry. Always forget, like, that job offer to Melbourne, Attica, was just kind of out of the blue in a way. It's not like y'all had an Australian connection at the time. It just happened, which is really pretty amazing. Because as you said, so you started making wine, you started a label. Is that the best way to?
Yeah, so we realized we were moving. The first thing I wanted to do was go make wine because I hadn't done it before. I was like, I don't want to work in a restaurant. I want to work outside.
Yeah.
And, so we got there. Jane got there in February of 2017, which would have been better. I needed to, give a little bit more notice with 11 Madison and kind of punctuate our life in New York. And so moved down the end of March. And it was actually it was a really wonderful moment because we got there essentially when 50 Best, they finished their voting in October and the awards come out the spring of the next year. So I got to Melbourne at the beginning of the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, which was coinciding with the World's 50 Best Awards in Melbourne.
Amazing.
So the festival was massive. And through the EMP connections and the EMP email address, I was able to I was essentially bartending and serving at this pop-up restaurant at the hub center of the Food and Wine Festival, which was perfect. I was like, okay, so I got there in the first 2 weeks, I was like meeting everyone in the Australian wine industry and restaurant industry. I was like, well, this is a great way to do this. Had the best time, tasted, 300 wines I never knew existed because that's what life moving to Australia was. And ended up being able to work the Wine Australia bar at the 50 Best Awards. And when the 50 Best Awards happen, the whole restaurant team can't travel. So it's usually the chef and the owner, there's a few people that go, but it was kind of surreal that Jane and I were able to be in Australia when EMP was named #1. So that was a pretty special moment. And that kind of kicked off our time in Australia. So it was pretty cool and, was able to find work. But yeah, I worked Harvest, and that was 2017, very briefly. 2018, I did pretty much a month of Harvest with Mac Forbes in the Yarra Valley. And, I was totally taken by Harvest when I would do a day here or a day there in the US. But after that, I was like, yeah, I need to do this. And ended up meeting, there's a winery in a region called Geelong, which is just on the other side of the bay from Melbourne, at an estate called Bannockburn. And in the US, I think the By Far wines might be a little more popular from this region, but Gary Farr essentially worked at and built Bannockburn for 30 years before purchasing the property across the street and creating By Far. And there's a long time friendship between the Farrs, the Cesses, and the Chaves. So I started buying Syrah out of this vineyard that Gerard Chave advised on the plant. Like, it was crazy, the connection and so on. It was also Australia's kind of first high density Pinot Noir planting, if you will. They had, where the fruit was at your knee height and everything. There was like 30,000 vines per hectare. And, and those wines that Gary Farr made in the early 90s, I was able to buy some and work with some when we were in Australia, are some of the most incredible Pinot Noirs I've ever had. So yeah, I was able to buy a couple ton of Syrah and mess around with it. And the winemaker there, Matt Holmes, was really generous with his time. And then there was another person that we started working with, Sierra Reed, who kind of helped me as well. And the next year, she allowed me into a vineyard that she was taking. It was actually the third oldest Grenache vineyard in the world. And there was a Cinsault plot, and I was able to start buying some Cinsault. And then someone offered her Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. And I really don't have anything interesting to say about Pinot Noir, but I'd love to make some Pinot Gris because everyone makes Pinot Noir. And before you knew it, I was, working in her winery, working in the other winery. I think my largest vintage was about 350 cases. And then 2020 kind of pushed it all back a bit. It's notoriously a bushfire. It was a really difficult wildfire vintage, both in California and Australia. And California and Australia, two very different geographical places. Australia is the size of the U.S., so we weren't affected by smoke taint or anything. However, the picking labor was being brought to regions that were being affected by smoke taint, or they were going home because of COVID.
Right.
So it was very difficult to get fruit off. It was a pretty challenging vintage, and I ended up having to leave. We ended up leaving earlier because of COVID, and our visas were up and everything. So it kind of got pretty messy. Wasn't able to go back in 2021 because of COVID and borders and things. And then I went back in 2022 for about 10 days to do a number of things, but also I made one of the wines. I made the Cinsault again in 22 and realized that I wasn't going to just kind of have a label that someone else made. This was not my livelihood. This was a way to find more connections within my livelihood. So kind of put it to bed in 2022. I do have aspirations of making a fortified Rancio style muscadine from Tennessee grapes, but that's still just in my head. It's not happened yet.
Do it. I mean, as a Texan, I've covered Texas wine for many, many years, and it's always like really fun to kind of highlight the things that are going on in the states other than the biggies, right? Like then California, Oregon, Washington, et cetera,
Yeah.
New York. So I'm really glad we touched on that. And I love that you said that you wanted to be able to find a connection to support your livelihood in terms of, you're in hospitality, for lack of a better phrase, like you're in the business side of wine, but to have gotten your hands dirty and to have really kind of been through that whole process of winemaking, I would think it adds an element to what it is that you do that, I don't know, brings all sorts of things like perspective, humility, empathy, all the other things in terms of understanding what it takes to get a really fantastic bottle of wine to the table to a guest,
Yeah, I mean, it's everything from what happens when you order a pallet of glass, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, I mean, we're very much in the business to business world of wine now with importing, and we communicate to professionals, and you really don't realize what a rack and return is and for until you do one.
Yeah.
And there is no, and it's unfortunate. I think it would be great if there was more hands-on opportunity for professionals in the urban centers where the hospitality industry thrives the most, or there's the greatest population, to actually have some hands-on experience like that. Just to be able to kind of your own skin in the game. I'll never forget, I was working harvest in the Finger Lakes at Weimer, and Fred Miro, the head winemaker, he's squeegeeing the sorting table, getting every last juice. I'm like, this guy's out of his mind. And then I'm making wine, whatever, 10 years, I don't know, whatever later. And I'm picking every little berry that's caught here to make sure it goes. I was like, I get it now.
Yep.
I want as
No.
much wine as I possibly can have out of the fruit that I bought. I understand. But it's just kind of those things that connects the dots. And you mentioned empathy. I mean, the supply chain. Every time I see a truck go down the highway now, or a
Yeah.
train with containers on it, I'm like, that could have my wine on it. Please don't, you've got my livelihood on your truck, and their livelihood is my livelihood, and so on, and not to fast forward, but like Legend just became a certified B Corp, and there's this declaration of interdependence that we sign, and the supply chain is interdependence. And by operating every single piece, or have lived, walked a day in the shoes of every part of the supply chain, production cycle, distribution, sales, I think you realize how you all have to depend on each other.
I want to bring this up. Let's move to Legend, because you guys were in Australia. It wasn't necessarily on your here's my 20-year plan for life, and you just happened to end up there, which was great. And it turned out great for both of you. But Australia, I hate to say region because it's gigantic. Jane and I've talked about this before too. That's like, we look at it as like one little place, but it's so vast, and we need to remember that. But it is a place that hasn't always been seen for everything that it is when it comes to wine. And so I love that, you guys decided not only to work there, and you fell in love with whatever was going on there when it came to wine, that you also decided, when we come back to the US, we're going to bring the good stuff here. We want people to know about Australian wine. So you created, what's the official title? Is it Legends Importing Company or Legends?
We just call it legend.
Okay, Legends. Okay.
So in Australia, everyone calls everyone a legend all the time. I'd like place an order with
Ah,
a
of
sales
course.
manager, thanks legend, or you'd
Yes.
open the door for someone, legend. You'd find $5 in your pocket, legend. So that's why we're Legend Imports.
I had never knew that. I love that. I've not been a ton to Australia, but my husband used to live there, and I remember that kind of coin coming out from him. So, how has that been, deciding to say, we're gonna I love the smile, to crack into, not only you've never been importers before, and that's fine, but then you're coming into the US and saying, hey guys, hey everyone, y'all need to be trying these wines, and you need to give Australia a look in a different way if you haven't already been doing so. Like, how has that been?
It's been the hardest thing that Jane and I have ever tried to do,
Okay.
to start there. But I think, it's also kind of been the greatest thing we've ever tried to do. We formed the business in July of 2020. So learning how to import, kind of all the rules went away in the beginning of COVID to do anything, which I think was a blessing.
Yeah.
That it wasn't like, oh, these people don't know what they're doing. It's like, oh, no one knows what they're doing. So it's okay. So you couldn't actually see how like completely off the deep end we were. And I think when you really commit to something that's, for you, that's different, new, exposing, whatever, you kind of become pretty shameless about asking for help.
Mm.
So we talked to every single person we could about all sorts of different things and so on. And we kind of just, it was like, okay, we're doing this. And Australia, like you said, hasn't always had the best reputation in the US. And the reality is, I don't think Australia ever had much of a reputation. In the 80s and early 90s, there were some really good wines coming over because they were really great wines.
Yeah.
And then probably the most used name in the wine industry, Robert Parker, and a few other people influenced the way wine was made and marketed, largely in the US, but throughout the world.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. And Australia in the US started becoming about style and brand and no longer place. And anytime a wine region does that, regardless of whether you're Australia or Portugal or Spain, or anytime I feel like someone goes, we're going to make a 99-point big red wine because we can, that's all it's about anymore. And wine is about people and places. It's not, and for it to be continuing and everlasting. And what's interesting is that fad in the US was not really what people were drinking in Australia. And it's certainly not what they're drinking today. A wonderful statistic: Molly Duker is not sold in Australia.
No.
We have shown bottles to wine Australians in the US and they don't know what it is. You can see, if you drive through McLaren Vale, you see a sign. They've just built a cellar door. If you go to the Molly Duker website now, and I don't like, I don't know if I can curse, but shit talking other businesses that have been successful. Randomly at one of the restaurants, I tasted a bottle of Velvet Glove yesterday, which I kind of relish in that opportunity every now and then. I think 98% of the volume is exported to the US. The rest goes to China. If you go online in the US, they have a US website that's just marketing. Everywhere else, you can buy wine online in pretty much any other country, and it's just an online store. They've built a cellar door. But I mean, with Rockpool in Australia, I ran, steakhouses and casinos. That's who you sell Molly Duker to.
Right.
And I feel like you can tell if something's actually in the market if it's not being sold to you. So I think what Australia became in the US was different from what it was in Australia. And, I think that's not an Australian issue. I think it happens in general in a lot of places, or, things are skewed and so on. And it kind of just continued in that fashion. Today, to bring it back to the Italian Wine Podcast, like I'll go out and pour wine for an account, and the first wine I pour is a Vermentino from Central Victoria, from Heathcote. And it's like the diversity of wine in Australia is endless. It's just a pretty remarkable place in what it's actually doing. And so much of our modern day viticultural technology was kind of researched and built in Australia. It's so not, and really never was, the thing that the US thinks it is. And I think today that's an opportunity. to go into a tasting and the bar is set so low, it's one thing. It's like, okay, I'm going to bring you some Chablis. It's like, well, I've had tons of Chablis. This Chablis better be good for me to be able to buy it. Or it's like, okay, I'm going to bring you some Australian Pinot Noir. It's like, okay, I don't think I've ever tasted Australian Pinot Noir. Oh, it's a pretty good price. And then you kind of see it and it's unique in the set. It doesn't taste like another place. And I think that's really important, that the wines are not like somewhere else. I mean, I can find something like Molly Duker made in California, made in South America. I could find those commercially manipulated wines anywhere. Why ship them from the other side of the world? It's not worth the effort, in my opinion. But, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. It's not been easy. It's progressing, it feels like.
Well, what I'm getting out of that is you guys are trying to spotlight and highlight those wines that are worth shipping halfway across the world and tell those stories, and that they are connected to people. And I'm going to do it for you, but I need to plug this book that you and Jane have written, How to Drink Australian, because it is the consummate guide, like the perfect quintessential guide to what in the world is going on over there. And I don't want to say Mark Davidson, who has also written a great book on the wines of Australia, but what you guys did is really kind of unveil what I think the hospitality industry, but also consumers, can really make it feel is approachable about Australian wine. So before we move to more stuff on TEXSOM and hospitality, I just want to plug that book. You guys did an amazing job with that book. It's super thick. It's the kind of thing that you should take time with, but it's also extremely approachable.
Thank you. No, the book was certainly a labor of love. We're on the road for, I guess, 5 months, the beginning of Legend, and we just realized that there was not any educational material out there, and we kind of didn't want to do it. Then I wanted to do it, and Jane didn't want to do it. Then we realized that we needed to do it. We're the only non-Australians associated with that book. There's 3 other contributors, a cartographer Martin von Weiss, Perfect Storm, retired National Geographic cartographer who opened a wine bar in Melbourne, did all the original maps, 2 different original artists, Australian publisher. And it was not easy. We intentionally got fired from our first publisher, but stayed with the kind of person as they moved. But anyway, but no, it's interesting. And I think it kind of speaks to the Australian mentality and where they are with wine. A book like that hadn't been written since 1976. That was like a full national educational guide with original maps and everything. And since then, all of the wine writing in Australia has been much more specific and much more regionally focused or era focused, and I think that kind of shows the Australian connection to wine a little bit. And Australian wasn't going to write that book because they had progressed beyond that point in speaking to the domestic market. Australia's connection to wine, and I guess kind of the last thing to plug with Australian wine so unique, is it didn't have to deal with phylloxera like it did with the US, preventing wine from flourishing when European culture colonized, for hundreds of years. So when Europeans arrived in Australia and colonized the east coast of Australia, they planted grapes when they planted wheat and started grazing cattle and everything, and the grapes worked. So for as long as European culture has been in Australia, wine has been a central system of agriculture. Right. That's not the case in the US. So you go to Australia and there's this European connection to wine, but they speak English. And many of them are, descendants of former convicts and rule breakers, and they live on an island. So it's this incredibly magical mix of a very authentic and earnest connection to wine. And yeah, it's a pretty unique place, and so not anything like it's been projected, marketed, or even taught and certified. I think that's something that really bothers us, that you can be a master sommelier and know absolutely nothing about Australian wine. And it's the same way about a few other countries too.
Yeah, I'd like to say, though, having studied, so I'm certified in the CMS, but also have my diploma in WSET. And I will say it's extremely intimidating to try to know about Australia. So for my own personal experience, I'm like, well, if I know enough about everything else, maybe I can wing it on Australia.
Totally.
But part of that's because there wasn't anything for the longest time to really sink your teeth into. So that's where I'm going to say, I think that stopped with your book. Again, Mark Davidson, don't want to cut him out, but that book changed for me, because I feel like again, the graphics, the way that y'all have designed it and laid it out, it makes it possible to hopefully not let that place be so intimidating. The way that, all the regions are set up, all of those things. I'm like, what is this called? Why is it called this? So I'm not defending the fact that it's not been explored as much, but I do think times are changing.
No, you're totally right. I mean, the amount of times I stood next to a table and talked about a wine region and someone's thought I've been there and haven't because I was able to read about enough about the region.
Right.
And still, I mean, like we're talking about 1-2 books, I mean, like there needs to be a lot more that's written and studies and so on. I think hopefully this is just the beginning of those resources.
Yes. Well, let's shift just a little bit, just because for TEXSOM, you aren't talking about Australia at all. You're actually doing something else very important. You and who else is I just lost it.
Nick Davis.
Nick. Yeah, Nick Davis. Y'all are going to do a seminar on service. So I'm guessing service specifically with the Court of Master Sommeliers in mind and how they do that. But it'll be a demonstration plus kind of, it says, discussion and scenarios. Tell me why this is important and what you guys want people to walk away with from this seminar with.
I think this is first kind of like a part 2 from what I did last year with Joe Zamorski. And that was very much tools of service and so on. And Nick and I are certainly still planning things. So how it's going to look is still a little up in the air. However, I, for one, am hoping we're not kind of pitting this to any kind of certification.
Great.
That this is much more useful in everyday real world scenarios and real businesses.
Love it.
I think the idea is some service scenarios, but for me, I think, what I think we hope to get across is we're presented with many, many scenarios every night in service. And the way in which we work our way through or apply service tactics to those scenarios, those are all very much functions that you can learn, that you practice. Those are mechanics. And the choice of which mechanics and applications to employ in those moments must be guided through the spirit of hospitality. And I think that's very much, for me, it's always, okay, this is what we need to do. If we do it this way or this way or this way, how do we make the guest feel? How do we affect, their spend? How do we affect the other parts of service? Are we able to do that in concert with the other team members, the other things that are going on in the dining room? Does it work well with our other task list and priority list of things that we need to accomplish in the next 10 minutes? But all of that needs to really rely on emotional impact. Hospitality is an emotion. I think it's funny. We always talk about how, emotions in the workplace, and you need emotionally lively people to execute great hospitality. So I think it's very much about, okay, how is this action going to make this person feel? And I think that's, for me, how service is guided by hospitality, but also it therefore extends it in a sense. So I think for me, there's a bit of duality there that I think would be fun to explore. I think that relies a lot on conversation. I know we don't have a lot of ability to do a ton of demonstrations, but we're going to try and do a few, and hopefully we can get the audience involved in some manner as well. So
I think that'd be great. I think everything about the conversation we've had so far, always for you coming back to connection of people place. I feel like you hit it right on the head when it comes to saying that, service, which can look, especially in places like an 11 Madison Park or whatever, can look like such a beautiful choreography, right? But that ultimately it's not about this perfection and this stylized, show, if you will. It is much more about, does that person come away from the evening feeling like they felt special, right? Or that they felt taken care of, which, coming from 11 Madison Park, that's where the book Unreasonable Hospitality comes from. And, like this idea that going beyond to connect with that person, whoever the guest is, or multiple guests, obviously, for the evening. And I love that you're immediately saying, hospitality is that first. I mean, of course, you need to have polished glasses, things like that. You need to have clean dishes, things like that.
No, but true. But how does a dirty glass make someone feel in a restaurant?
Exactly.
It's like we used to talk about this at EMP a lot. And, you imagine that bistro with the small tables and there's 20 of them on a banquette. And when they're in line perfectly and all the candles on them are in line perfectly, you don't necessarily notice, but because everything is in line, there is a feng shui to it. It creates a peaceful,
Yes.
happy feeling. It creates energy based on what we see. But when those tables are askew and the candles are out of order, it looks messy, and that starts to impact the way we feel about where we are. Like all of those things, we always used to say that excellence lies in the pursuit of perfection. There is no perfection. But, if you can have an environment appear perfect in that manner, it almost as if the environment goes away a little bit. And I think it's kind of how, Danny Meyer's setting the table. It's very much how you set the beginning.
Yes.
And it's almost like what foot do you want to start on with the guest experience? Do you want to start on a foot that has them noticing a messy restaurant with a bathroom without paper towels in it, or the air dryer doesn't work and there's water on the floor, and there's a dirty glass and the server's apron is dirty? Or do you want them to walk in and not notice anything because it's all exactly as it should be?
Yeah. There should be a whole book on the psychology of all of that, because you're exactly right. You don't think that matters, but it does matter when you do walk into a place where it's not organized and clean. I think that's a really interesting point. You've been through the ups and downs of living in different places during COVID, after COVID, and then also, going through different business trends and wine sales trends of what's happening now in the wine industry. When it comes to hospitality, what does the world need more right now? What should we maybe let go of, but what do we need more of?
I mean, from a systemic kind of overhaul, I wish we were not a tipping society.
Ah, okay. Well, this is for the Italian Wine Podcast. Yeah, so this is great. Tell me more about this. Yeah.
I've worked and I think it's sometimes market to market or city to city in the US where the tips pool structure differs. You go to New York, there are a small percentage of restaurants that are not just one tip pool. And you go to a city like Nashville, and very few restaurants are one tip pool where everyone's in it together. I think that every aspect of service and hospitality is impacted by segregated earning. I think it greatly impacts the way in which management teams are able to be effective. I think it impacts the way people approach providing for guests. I think it impacts teamwork. I was the beverage director at the restaurant in Nashville. We were in New York together, and we were eating at Kokodak in New
Mhm.
York. And someone not associated with our table came over, topped up our wine, asked us if we want another bottle. And he was like, "That was amazing." He's like, "We need to be able to do that." I was like, "We need all hands on deck to manage that level of everyone engagement. It's not just a beverage director or a bar manager. It's everyone needs to be all on the same page for that." But this is a pooled house. They all get a cut of the tip on that bottle of wine that person sold. That's why it's meaningful to them. Unless you move in that direction, there are barriers that are created. But then beyond that, I just think that, I don't know, in Australia, we lived in a non-tipping society for 3 years, and it just felt like we're asked so much of our hospitality workers to be hospitable. It would be really wonderful if we could take like how much they were going to earn that day out of every interaction that they had, right? Because it's like, I need to do this for the guest because I want to be hospitable and because I need to make money. Whereas if they could clock into work and knew they were being paid and they just had to focus on being hospitable, then I just think it would be a much more enjoyable experience, both for the guest and for the employee. You see a lot of scenarios where restaurants who are doing the right thing to provide for their staff by adding maybe a little surcharge on the menu or something like that. And for me, it's just like, can we just charge what we need to charge to run and operate a business that supports its employees' livelihoods properly and be done with it? I know it's a lot easier said than done.
Yeah.
I thought COVID provided the reset button we needed to kind of move to that, especially when restaurant workers were being impacted so much, but it didn't happen. And I don't know that it really will. I think it's very hard for a single restaurant in a market to go to hourly no tips because you need to be busy, busy, busy in order to do that, and consistently busy. But we did it for a few years at 11 Madison, and it worked. It reduced the pay gap between the kitchen and dining room teams. It reduced the pay gap between the dining room hourly teams and management. Notoriously in restaurants, managers make less than the hourly staff.
Yes.
It's not the case in Australia. I think it's there's just a lot of things that, fundamentally the system is not working for the best outcome that we desire in a hospitality business.
Yeah, I think that deserves a much deeper look. And I think everything from culture to economics to, again, depending on where you are, whether it's Australia, but more importantly, like New York to Nashville to Austin to, it's complicated. But I agree with you that it again allows hospitality to shine forth when it's appropriately placed that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so different across the country, right? In Nashville today, the tip credit minimum wage is $2.13 an hour still. In Denver, they got rid of the tip credit minimum wage. Everyone's making $18 an hour, and they're still getting the same 20% tips on top of it. And that's probably like one of the most affordable places to open a restaurant, and probably the least affordable or most expensive place to open a restaurant right now in the US. But, I think it's proof that there is no real one direction that's working, and there hasn't been.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, this is a great conversation. I feel like we could probably go for another 2 hours, but I don't know if the listeners will stick it out with us. Let's do like a part 2 and a part 3 and a part 4. So I am excited for this seminar at TEXSOM. I feel like even just talking to you, I have a better understanding of what I'm going to get out of it. I hope that the people that attend this will also get something deeper than they thought they would. I look forward to it. And thank you so much for being a part of this.
No, it's my pleasure. I know one question you sent that we didn't get to was about Italian wine. And
Yes.
because it is the Italian Wine Podcast, I guess I should plug that. My wine journey started with Italian wine, not French wine, and learning about Italian wine. So I knew what a DOC was before an AOC. I worked at this wonderful restaurant in New Jersey called Tre Piani, and our maitre d' was this little 60-year-old dude named Giancarlo Squitteri. Taught me how to tie a tie. Some of my most fond wine memories and hospitality memories are surrounded by Italian wine. And I think its diversity supports how authentic Italian wine is. Yeah, both for me and Jane, a great love. So
excellent. Well, I feel the same way. And I love that you mentioned a couple things about grape varieties that are Italian in origin, but thriving in Australia. And I feel like that kind of crossover is what we need to see more of, in the wine world. And it excites me to think that something that started for you, like with Italian wine, has evolved into where you are today, which is pretty impressive. So, well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Here's a Texas wine tidbit that proves everything is bigger in Texas isn't just a saying. At 268,820 square miles, that's about 696,000 square kilometers, Texas is actually larger than France by more than 50,000 square kilometers. You could fit all of Switzerland and a good chunk of Germany inside Texas and still have room left over. And with that kind of scale, it makes sense that Texas wine regions are just as diverse as the landscape itself. This is a state shaped by volcanic uplifts, inland seas, earthquakes, and ancient river systems. You'll find everything from limestone plateaus and granite outcrops to sandy soils and a fertile alluvial plain, all of which influence how and what Texans grow. Today, Texas is home to 8 official American Viticultural Areas, or AVAs, with a couple more on the way. And get this, the Texas Hill Country AVA, right in the heart of the state, isn't just the most visited, it's also the 3rd largest AVA in the entire United States, covering more than 9 million acres, or about 3.6 million hectares. Pair that with the Texas High Plains AVA, which sits at over 1,000 meters in elevation and produces the majority of the state's wine grapes. And you've got 2 regions that form the backbone of Texas wine. One draws wine lovers with its scenic beauty and hospitality. The other fuels the industry with high-tech viticulture and sun-drenched vineyards. So the next time someone asks, what does Texas wine taste like? You'll need to follow up with another question. Which part of Texas are we talking about? Because just like France, there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. Texas is big, bold, and beautifully varied in landscape, in geology, and in the glass. This series is proudly sponsored by the Texas Department of Agriculture's Uncork Texas Wines program, which celebrates Texas wine culture by promoting local wineries and grape growers, both in-state and around the world, building a vibrant community around the Texas-made wine. Be sure to subscribe and rate the show wherever you get your podcasts. And don't miss our Texas Wine Tidbit in every episode, a fun little fact, insight, or story that highlights the people and places behind this exciting wine scene.